being the perfect child may have been the worst thing that ever happened to you. Have you ever noticed how, so often, the quietest child in the room is not the lightest on the inside? That overly obedient, overly polite child who never causes trouble is usually praised but rarely truly heard. Behind the good behavior, there is an emotional silence that didn't come out of nowhere. It was learned, reinforced, and slowly normalized. Maybe no one explicitly taught that child to ignore their inner voice. But when love comes with conditions, when mistakes lead to emotional distance, and when pleasing others becomes a survival rule, something inside begins to break. Authenticity is gradually exchanged for acceptance, and self-erasure starts to look like maturity. That's where the false self is born, functional, polite, efficient, and deeply exhausted. This content is not about blaming parents or creating labels. It's about understanding how excessive obedience shapes identity, feeds low self-esteem, and pushes fully grown adults into lives of people-pleasing, exhaustion, and invisibility. If you've always felt that being too good came at a cost, maybe it's time to look at that with more honesty and less guilt. There is a quiet child who almost never draws attention. The obedient child, the one who learns early not to disturb, not to ask for too much, not to make mistakes. On the outside, everything looks fine. On the inside, emotional silence slowly settles in as a habit. No one notices, because pain that doesn't make noise rarely receives care. And without realizing it, that child learns that feeling too much is dangerous. Perfect behavior becomes an elegant armor. The child gets good grades, helps others, follows rules, avoids conflict but pays for it with emotional suppression. Uncomfortable emotions are swallowed, desires are postponed, and authenticity begins to be negotiated in small installments. The unspoken message is clear: be easy to deal with, and everything will be okay. But that agreement charges high interest later in life. Over time, the child stops listening to their own inner voice. They adapt so thoroughly to their environment that they begin to confuse adaptation with identity. It looks like maturity, but it's self-erasure disguised as virtue. And while everyone applauds the good behavior, the invisible weight remains quietly growing, preparing the ground for what comes next. There is a very thin line between healthy discipline and self-annihilation, and almost no one teaches where it lies. The obedient child is often celebrated as an example, while their emotional silence is mistaken for maturity. But obeying all the time is not necessarily a sign of inner balance. Sometimes, it's simply fear of making mistakes, of disappointing others, of losing affection. Healthy discipline strengthens identity, excessive obedience weakens it. When a child learns that they can't question, disagree, or feel anger, they begin to shape a false self in order to survive. Authenticity is pushed aside, and emotional suppression becomes routine. Everything seems to function until the body and the mind begin to collect the debt. Hidden suffering is often invisible even to the one who carries it. The child grows up believing that being good means having no needs. Later on, this logic feeds low self-esteem and difficulty recognizing personal limits. Without noticing, obedience stops being a choice and becomes an emotional prison. At some point in childhood, the child realizes that being who they are comes at a cost. A disapproving look, emotional withdrawal, constant criticism. The obedient child is born less out of choice and more out of survival. Emotional silence emerges as a shield, and pleasing others becomes a way to stay safe within the bond. Obedience stops being a behavior and turns into a strategy. The child learns to read the environment better than themselves, adjusting emotions, words, and gestures to avoid rejection. Emotional suppression deepens, while authenticity is pushed further and further down. They begin to live for others, not for their own identity. This pattern feels natural. The child grows up believing that love must be earned. Fear of mistakes shapes the false self, and self-erasure starts to look like virtue. What began as childhood protection lays the foundation for adult relationships marked by people-pleasing and emotional exhaustion. When love comes with invisible rules, the child learns quickly. They understand that affection appears when they obey, when they please, when they don't challenge. Conditional love becomes a silent truth: I am loved for what I do, not for who I am. Emotional silence becomes the price of belonging. This emotional adaptation happens far too early. Inconvenient emotions are suppressed to preserve the bond. Suppression becomes automatic, while authenticity is traded for acceptance. Identity is shaped through someone else's gaze. The cost appears later. The adult grows up feeling the need to constantly prove their worth. Low self-esteem feeds on this logic, creating a persistent emptiness, a sign that something essential was left behind. The exchange happens quietly. The child realizes certain traits threaten connection and decides to hide them. To maintain acceptance, they sacrifice parts of themselves. The obedient child believes they are maturing, when in reality they are drifting away from their own authenticity. Opinions are softened. Boundaries ignored. Desires postponed. The false self takes control, while the inner voice grows quieter and quieter. Self-erasure seems small at first, but it creates inner confusion and identity loss. The most painful part is that this exchange is often praised. No one sees the emotional silence holding the image together. While the world approves, the true self waits patiently for a chance to re-enter the conversation. The obedient child grows up, but the pattern remains. Now they are the adult who is always available, understanding, conflict avoidant. People pleasers say yes before they even hear their own inner voice. Emotional silence keeps everything in apparent harmony. Saying no brings guilt. Prioritizing oneself feels selfish. Emotional suppression shows up as constant fatigue, contained irritation, and a feeling of not being seen. Life becomes centered around others' expectations. Eventually, the body sends the bill. Emotional burnout appears. Low self-esteem disguises itself as humility. The false self keeps functioning, while the true self asks quietly, who am I when I'm not pleasing? When pleasing becomes a way of existing, identity fragments. On the outside, a functional self. On the inside, a silenced one. Emotional silence begins to organize choices, relationships, and even dreams. Everything is done right, yet life doesn't fully feel like one's own. Authenticity appears only in rare moments, while the false self dominates. The inner voice tries to surface, but fear of disappointing others pushes it back down. Confusion grows: am I like this, or did I learn to be this way? Low self-esteem thrives in the absence of a clear identity, creating a void that no level of performance can fill. The false self was born as protection, but it becomes a prison. Polite, adaptable, competent, and deeply tired. The obedient child learned that showing too much cost love. On the outside, everything works. On the inside, a constant emptiness. Low self-esteem shows up as the feeling of never being enough. Acceptance exists, but belonging does not, because authenticity is missing. Maintaining this mask requires energy. Emotional suppression generates anxiety, irritability, and inner disconnection. The inner voice keeps reminding us that living this way was never the original plan. Emotions don't disappear when ignored. They transform. Suppression turns into anxiety, tension, and a constant state of alert. Perfectionism emerges as a defense. Doing everything flawlessly feels like protection from rejection, but it feeds emotional burnout. The mind never rests, and emotional silence persists. Quiet resentment appears. The person gives too much and receives too little, but doesn't know how to ask differently. Authenticity remains postponed. Society rewards conformity. The obedient child learns that over-adaptation brings approval. Questioning or feeling deeply becomes a problem. Schools, companies, and relationships prefer agreeable people. The false self fits in. Self-erasure is mistaken for maturity, and emotional suppression for professionalism. The result is collective exhausted adults with low self-esteem and fear of disagreement. Authenticity becomes a risk, setting the stage for individual awakening. Awakening begins when someone realizes their exhaustion comes from self-erasure. Emotional silence stops working, and awareness emerges, uncomfortable, but freeing. This process involves grief. Grief for the adapted childhood. For the repressed emotions. Feeling the pain is reorganization. The inner voice begins to be heard again. Small gestures strengthen identity, saying no, writing, reading Alice Miller or Brené Brown. The false self loses strength, creating space for healing. Reparenting means offering yourself what was missing: safety, boundaries, and validation. It means telling your inner obedient child that they no longer need to be silent to be loved. Healing happens through simple practices: checking in with feelings, noticing self-erasure, respecting the inner voice. Identity integrates, and low self-esteem loosens its grip. When one person breaks this pattern, the legacy changes. Authenticity replaces performance, and individual healing becomes shared freedom. Maybe, throughout this script, you recognized yourself in more than one moment. Maybe you realized that much of your exhaustion doesn't come from weakness, but from a lifetime of emotional suppression. The obedient child did what they had to do to survive, and that deserves respect, not judgment. The question that remains is, what do you want to do with this awareness now? What small choices can you begin making to honor your inner voice? Where does self-erasure still hide behind kindness? What would change if, today, you allowed yourself to be just a little more authentic, even with fear? Transformation doesn't begin with dramatic ruptures, but with simple, repeated acts of emotional truth. If this content touched something inside you, know that this is only the beginning. Here, the conversation continues. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow upcoming content as we keep deepening this path of awareness, healing, and identity reconstruction without masks, without silence, without needing to disappear in order to be accepted.